Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be given the opportunity to talk to you today about my favorite author, an author to whose career I've devoted the better part of the last decade. An author who I find particularly important to the development of American literature, an author who basically propelled it forward after the stagnation that emerged at the end of American postmodernism, and that author is David Foster Wallace. Um, I he's a particularly important author to me, but also to many others, because it is very rare that an avant-garde, difficult author, famous for the publication of an experimental novel that is 1,079 pages long, um, gets a cult following. It is very rarely it is very rare for books of such length and complexity as Infinite Jest um, to become so popular, to become so influential, and to be talked about so much, both by critics and scholars, but also by academics and popular readers. I guess I'll start with saying a few words about who Wallace was um, before I get to what I find is the most important part of Wallace's literary legacy, and that is the um the influence he had on shaping certain moral attitudes in a world that is saturated by mass media, by the abuse of alcohol and drugs, and perhaps most importantly, by loneliness. Um, so, just as a way of introduction, I'll say a few words about who Wallace was as a person. Um, he came from an academic family. Both his mother and his father were professors. His mother was a professor of English. His father was a professor of philosophy, specializing in ethics, which is quite interesting when you consider the fact that ethics became one of Wallace's most important themes in his fiction, and that is coupled with his fascination with language and his experimental and innovative uses of the English language. So he was pretty much like a campus child. He was raised in an academic environment, and he was a very gifted child. But in the early years, actually, not a lot. There was not a lot of hints that he would become a prominent writer, because he was preoccupied with sports, and later on, also, he began his adventure with marijuana, which transformed him as a person and transformed him as a writer, and features prominently in his literature that very often deals with issues of addiction. So Wallace actually initially followed his father's footsteps to an extent because he too decided to become a philosopher, and he too decided to study at Amherst College, a very prestigious college. His father went to, and as a fun fact, I can only tell you that he was. His academic records to this day stand unbeaten at Amherst College. Because when he went to study there, he immersed himself immediately with in learning. He would spend the bulk of his times, the bulk of his time in libraries, um, trying trying to best himself at getting the highest possible grades. But during that time, another important thing happened for Wallace because he working so hard on his grades, trying to, in a way, alleviate his loneliness and his feeling of being out of place with spending so many hours in the library studying. He exhausted himself, um, and that led to some very serious mental problems. It is disputed whether that revealed those mental problems or whether he developed those mental problems during his time at Amherst. Um, but it is undeniable that it was then that his lifelong depression would get in the way of his life and his career, but also in a way shape his life and his career. He was a very ambitious student, as I said. So when he met, kind of like a soulmate, really, at Amherst, Mark Costello, um, they they actually engaged in kind of like a friendly competition in terms of getting the best grades they could. But unfortunately, due to Wallace's mental condition, he had to skip a year, go back home for some treatment, and just to get his life together. Um, Costello went on a year ahead and completed a double summa cum laude at Amherst. So Wallace, a student of philosophy, a very ambitious student of philosophy, decided that, well, if Costello did it, he wanted to do it too. And as a result, he not only finished his thesis in philosophy, focusing on the issue of determinism and free will, but also decided to write a novel as his second thesis. And his second thesis, actually, after revisions and changes, would eventually be published in 1987 as Wallace's debut novel, The Broom of the System. By that time, actually, Wallace had already decided to pursue a literary career because, as he said, in the process of working on The Broom of the System, he discovered that literature was far more engaging to his for his mind than philosophy ever could be. So he decided to actually pursue a career in literature, and in order to do that, he thought entering a creative writing program might be a good idea. Having revised a few different creative writing programs amongst the top such programs in the US, he decided to study at the University of Arizona. Also, due to the fact that he was offered a pretty good scholarship to do so. So Wallace moved to Arizona. Didn't really fit in entirely with, especially some of the professors that were teaching there, because Wallace found them too conservative. Having developed his sensibilities, reading authors like Don DeLillo, Pynchon, Gaddis, Bartholomew, he was very much at that stage in his life a child of postmodernism. So, to a large extent, he was disappointed with the kind of realist literature he was expected to write in Arizona, but he did continue to write. He wrote quite a few stories during that time, which eventually would lead to the publication of his first collection of short stories and second book called Girl with Curious Hair in 1989. Even though some scholars actually consider that book to be his weakest literary effort, I think that it's a very important book for Wallace himself because it marks a transitional period for his literature. He basically, in that book, finishing it with a long novella called Westwards, the Course of the Empire Takes Its Way, makes his final break with the authors of postmodernism, his old masters, and decides that American literature needs to pursue other goals, that postmodernism pretty much exploited itself. Around that time, he also started writing essays, and in 1993, he published one of his most quoted essays called A Unibus Pluram, of One Many, which is a study of American fiction under the influence of television. Television would actually, and generally mass media, would become a prominent theme in his fiction. Wallace himself would admit that he was a TV addict. In later years, he would refuse to keep a television in his house because he said, well, if he had a television set, he'd be watching it all the time. In that essay, he makes the argument that the proliferation of television in the U.S. and especially the way that American television has found a way to incorporate irony had a very detrimental effect both on U.S. fiction and on U.S. society. But those years after Arizona, after the publication of Girl with Curious Hair, were difficult for Wallace. They were difficult for Wallace because having broken his ties with his postmodern masters, the big question loomed, like, what is next. If this is not the way forward for American literature, what is that way forward? And it would take him quite some time to discover what that way forward would be. And it would be this. It would be this massive novel published in 1996 called Infinite Jest. It's a strange novel. It's a strange novel because it, in a way, defined his career, but also remained a ghost for Wallace for a great many years. It's a mammoth novel, as I have said, a novel that is very difficult to present because it is so rich and so complex. It is full of his trademark footnotes. Even if you look at the Polish edition of his novel, well, this one is actually even bigger. You can see how obsessive, how engaged he was in the process of writing the novel, and how much he wanted to include in the novel. Actually, believe it or not, the final shape of Infinite Jest that finally made it to the bookstores was a severely revised and cut up text, because I've had the pleasure of looking at Wallace's manuscripts that are housed in the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, and there you can see that he actually intended the novel to be at least three times this size. As I said, it's very difficult to say what it's about, so maybe I'll just say a few words about how it's constructed. It's constructed around three major narratives. It is set in the not too distant future, from 1996, so roughly our times, but it turns out that while Wallace was prophetic in some ways, the world actually turned out to be a little different than he anticipated. But you have these three narrative pillars. One is the story of Don Gately, who's a recovering drug addict. He's someone who manages to overcome his terrible addiction, and the stimulus for him to get clean is that he actually accidentally kills a person. Gately comes from what today you would call a pathological household. His mother is an alcoholic. His stepfather is very abusive. Gately has a difficult time in school, even though he's a very promising football player due to his huge size and general athletic ability. However, his upbringing weighs on him heavily, and over time he develops a very serious drug addiction, which leads him to a life of crime. he needs to support his addiction, and as a result, he becomes a burglar. But during one of the burglaries, he quite ridiculously, and this is a very ridiculous book, by the way, in some ways, um, very ridiculously strangles a man by putting putting a piece of cloth in his mouth to prevent him from screaming, not realizing that the man has a very bad cold and he can't breathe through his nose. So he basically hits rock bottom. Eventually, he's sent to prison, and of course, in prison, he has to abandon his use of drugs. Then he decides to. Then he decides to. Then he decides to enter a halfway house, join AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and eventually he becomes one of the employees in that halfway house, taking care of fellow recovering addicts. And I'll leave it here for you. I don't want to spoil the novel too much. So I'll leave Gately's story here and just move on to the next narrative pillar, which is that of Hal in Condensa. And Hal lives very close to Don Gately. He lives and trains at the Enfield Tennis Academy, a very prominent school for promising young tennis players that was established by his father, James Incandenza, who basically took all of the money he made as a very prominent scientist to establish a school that would that through sport would help his young people make a good life for themselves in a world that is saturated with meaningless pleasure and alcohol, drugs, and so on and so forth. So he does that, fully aware of the terrible consequences and the terrible life of an addict, because he's an alcoholic himself. An alcoholic whose drinking is marked by loneliness. He is haunted by his desire to communicate, especially with his children, but he can't. In the meantime, he actually becomes a film director and tries to create a film that would be a way for him to communicate with his children, and kind of by accident makes the eponymous Infinite Jest. Infinite Jest in the novel is a film, which is quite paradoxical. A film so compelling that it makes basically the viewers stop everything they're doing, stare into the screen until they die of dehydration and starvation. That film becomes the target for terrorists, because the third pillar of the narration in Infinite Jest focuses on the political dimension of life in Northern America. And I say Northern America because in the world of Infinite Jest, the United States pretty much takes over Canada and Mexico, forming the Organization of North American Nations, ONAN for short, quite tellingly. And of course, not everybody's happy about this, and especially in Canada, groups of insurgents arise, and they try to regain at least partial independence. And in order to do so, um, they try to get hold of this eponymous infinite jest. The book, the book is a study of so many different problems that haunt contemporary America. Um, the characters are very often miserable and lonely and lost in a world that provides unprecedented technologies for communication, and at the same time alienates people to to a great extent. That diagnosis was, I would say, pretty much a diagnosis of Wallace, well, of the life that Wallace was living, quite, quite painfully, haunted by addiction, mental disease, and terrible loneliness. He decided that literature would not only need to diagnose and describe a problem, um, but more importantly, to somehow try to find a remedy for this problem. And I would say that Infinite Jest's success is testimony to the fact that Wallace at least partially found a way to alleviate this loneliness. As evidence, I will only tell you about the great community that has formed worldwide around this novel. Also through the internet, which Wallace was very cautious about. But it turned out that the internet not only did a lot of harm, but actually did a lot of good. One of the ways in which the novel tries to alleviate loneliness is through engagement. It's a massive novel for a reason. It's not massive just to prove a point that Wallace could write a massive novel. It's a massive novel because it makes you work for it. It's a massive novel that because the effort that you put into reading it is supposed to pull you out of the kind of stagnation that popular entertainment puts you into. Because Wallace strongly believed that the biggest threat of things like television or alcohol or drugs, the biggest problem with those things is that it makes you passive. So he figured, okay, if all this makes you passive, I should do something to make you active, and to actively engage you in this really, really hard work that that is supposed to be intended to be rewarding in the end, and but not rewarding in an obvious way, but in a very quiet and lasting way. Very much like very much the way AA worked for alcohol addicts, and Wallace was a lifelong alcoholic who would attend AA meetings wherever he went, wherever he moved. He would always try to find the local AA group, and he learned a lot from AA. And one of the things that he learned in AA was that work is a way out of addiction. It's very interesting that after the publication of this humongous, massive novel, Wallace published a text that I would like to talk to you today about, and this is actually Wallace's shortest text. I'll show you. This is the short story that I wanted to talk to you about. It's only 86 words long, including the title, but I think it helps us to understand what sort of effort Wallace was engaging in. I'll read it to you because it's very brief, and then I'll talk to you about it a little bit. When they were introduced, he made a witticism, hoping to be liked. She laughed very hard, hoping to be liked. Then each drove home alone, staring straight ahead, with the very same twist to their faces. The man who'd introduced them didn't much like either of them, though he acted as if he did, anxious as he was to preserve good relations at all times. One never knew, after all. Now did one, now did one, now did one. After studying loneliness for over 1,000 pages, Wallace seems to have gotten to the crux of it. In a radically condensed history of post-industrial life, he writes about the paralyzing effect of self-consciousness, of a self-consciousness that seems to be, as the title itself suggests, characteristic to wealthy, developed countries. A paralysis caused by politeness, a paralysis caused by this huge popularity contest that we all seem to engage in, also due to our exposure to the media. The one that we seem to engage in, always trying to develop good relationships with other people, but never profound relationships with other people. Because in Infinite Jest, and especially in his later work, Wallace would definitely pay much attention to the quality of the relationships with other people, and in his fiction, after Infinite Jest, this becomes a significant issue, because Infinite Jest is a study of loneliness, is a study of all the reasons why we become isolated or alienated from other people, of all the reasons we are trying to escape from other people or the world. Um, but after Infinite Jest, he decided that uh, it would be interesting to turn turn the coin around and study exactly what we're escaping from. Study relationships with other people and see how the formation of these relationships actually contributes contributes significantly to our well-being. Um, in this short story, a radically condensed history of post-industrial life, comes from a collection that Wallace published after Infinite Jest. Seemingly, he was basically responding to criticism, saying that Infinite Jest doesn't really tackle meaningfully relationships between men and women. So he decided to do precisely that. He decided to tackle this problem uh, with a short story collection that centers around a series of pieces, transcripts of interviews with the eponymous hideous men who reveal a very wide range of manipulations, abuse, both mental abuse and physical abuse, taking advantage of women. Um, these brief interviews present men as basically, well, the one he writes about, as basically unable to form relationships with women due to the fact that they cannot be sincere either with the women or, in fact, with themselves. Um, somewhere there, somewhere I would say between Infinite Jest and brief interviews with hideous men, a prominent literary current starts to arise. It has a few different names. There's postmodernism. Um, there's metamodernism. Um, but the one that I suppose I like best is New Sincerity. Um, the New Sincerity movement basically studies the paradoxes of sincerity, um, heavily relying on philosophers such as Jean-Paul Sartre um, and other existentialist thinkers like Kierkegaard too. Um, the movement basically diagnoses many of contemporary problems uh, with the lack of sincerity. And also, Wallace ties this in with ties this in with living in relationships with people, but also um, he tries to write a literature that would manifest sincerity. Um, Now, I suppose I would like you to pause this video very briefly and turn to the link below, um, where you will be able to listen to Wallace's very famous speech, commencement address, called This is Water, where you will basically hear what kind of advice he gives to young people beginning their adult life, and what sort of thinking he considers helpful. Okay, right. What you probably might find striking about um, This is Water is that it might seem naive. It might seem naive to to choose to believe whatever's most beneficial for you at a particular in a particular moment, um, because under your skin, you might be thinking, "Oh, I'm just fooling myself. I'm just fooling myself that the lady who screamed at her child in a supermarket is really a good person deep down inside. I might be fooling myself that the person who cut me off in traffic is taking their child to a hospital." But I would say it's not naive on Wallace's part. I would say it's very pragmatic. And I would say that Wallace, in his studying of contemporary human relationships, encourages you to be pragmatic in your kindness. Um, Being a good person to Wallace is being a good person to yourself. And being a good person to yourself allows you to be a good person to other people. For him, those things are very strongly connected. Um, for reasons, for very paradoxical reasons, um, by fooling yourself into believing the best about people, you are not only doing yourself a favor, doing away with all the frustration and anger and disappointment of everyday life. You're doing away with all this at the same time exercising a sort of kindness um, in other people or towards other people, and then enticing a similar type of kindness from them to yourself and others. This is Water was an important text for Wallace. Perhaps not an important text for Wallace scholars, but an important text for Wallace. Because after Infinite Jest, Wallace started working on a novel that in his mind was to outshine Infinite Jest, outshine it in every single way. He wanted to create a work more mature, more wise, and even more brilliant. Um, he struggled with it. He struggled with it immensely, to the point where he actually had to see his psychiatrist about not being able to focus his attention enough in order to produce the kind of work that he really intended to produce. So he was taken off the medication that he was on for many years, and then he was introduced to a new type of medication that wouldn't restrict his concentration levels quite so much, but he didn't take to that medicine well. So he had to come down from that medication to in order to return to his old medication, but it turned out that it didn't really work anymore on him. So, in this state of chemical imbalance in 2008, Wallace unfortunately ended up hanging himself. But before he did, he put his manuscript, The Pale King, on a desk in his garage, and he illuminated it with many lamps for his wife to find after discovering his body. Um, he wanted it to be published, and it did get published, and it did get published. And when it did get published, as the posthumous The Pale King, we got a glimpse of what he was working on. When you think about The Pale King, a study of tedious work at the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, the most boring type of work that you can imagine. Wallace writes, in the boredom you can find bliss. In the work that is tedious, you can find true meaning and illumination. Everything is in your hands, and you are responsible for your own happiness, and kindness plays a huge part in your happiness. And that's what I wish you. Thank you very much for listening to me.